Museum. My name is Patrick Donovan. I'm the president of the Varnum Continentals, Inc. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're all volunteer. We've existed since 1907. We own and operate 2 museum properties. So right here at the Varnum Army Museum, it houses the largest collection of Rhode Island military history dating from the 17th century all the way through to the present day. If you didn't get a chance to go downstairs, I hope you'll come back for either a private tour or one of our open houses that we're running about twice a month right now. If you go to our website, just do a Google search of Varnum Armory. We have one this Sunday from 10 a.m. till 2 p.m., so I encourage you to come back and take a walk through. The other museum property that we own and operate, you can see at the far end on the panel sign, it's the Varnum House, James Mitchell Varnum's actual estate. So we take the name of James Mitchell Varnum, born in Dracut, Mass. Here in East Greenwich, he's a lawyer, later becomes a judge. He's a 2-term member of the Continental Congress. He's one of the founders of the Kentish Guard militia, who still exists today, just a couple of blocks up on the hill. He formed that unit together with who would become General Nathaniel Greene. And later, James Mitchell Varnum would become a brigade commander in the Continental Line Army under George Washington. He would eventually come back to Rhode Island during the war, and late in the war, he would be commissioned a major general of all Rhode Island militia forces. He was present here for the Battle of Rhode Island. So I welcome everyone here for the Battle of Rhode Island Association's lecture series, sponsored by Bank Newport. Tonight we have a very special speaker, Dr. Friederike Baer. She's an associate professor of history at Pennsylvania State University, Abington College. She holds a PhD in early American history from Brown University. Her work has been supported with research grants from organizations such as the American Philosophical Society, Library Company of Philadelphia, University of Michigan Clements Library, and German Academic Exchange Service. For her most recent book, Hessian's German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War, she was awarded the 2023 Society of Cincinnati Prize. And so without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Friederike Baer.
Do you want to take your laptop? I need the space.
Okay.
Great. Thank you for this introduction. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Battle of Rhode Island Association for inviting me to share some of my research about the Hessians or German soldiers in the Revolutionary War. And thank you, of course, to the Varnum Armory Museum for hosting this event. Thanks for all of you here in person, and also welcome to anybody who's joining us on Zoom, wherever you may be. So I would like to say a few things, a few general words about who these German soldiers were, these people, these thousands of soldiers and civilians that we know as Hessians, how they ended up in North America, before shifting my focus on the German soldiers who went to Rhode Island. So a brief introduction. In the 1770s and 1780s, as many as 40,000 German soldiers were hired to defend British imperial interests on 4 continents: in America, on Gibraltar and Minorca, in India, and in South Africa. The vast majority, at least 30,000, saw service in America. Before I continue, let me emphasize that by around 1780, 1781, in other words, 4 or 5 years into the war, 1/3 of the British regular army strength in North America consisted of German auxiliaries. So this was not an insignificant presence. It is also important to mention that Britain's employment of foreign soldiers was nothing unusual. Britain had fought most of its 17th and all of its 18th century wars, major wars anyway, with the help of foreign auxiliaries. And Britain was not alone in this regard. Other major European powers, such as France, Prussia, Russia, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, also employed foreign troops. In fact, in the 18th century, the typical European army was a multinational force. In addition, the quote-unquote trade in soldiers, as it is sometimes called, was an acceptable form of revenue. Rulers rented out soldiers to foreign powers for subsidy payments, and they used the income to support, in some cases, lavish lifestyles. This earned them criticism, most famously for, quote-unquote, selling their subjects, quote, like cattle, to have their throats cut, as the King of Prussia put it in a letter to the French philosopher Voltaire in 1776. But they also used the revenue to pay off territorial debt. In fact, even Frederick the Great of Prussia agreed that the practice was acceptable if that was its main purpose. And they used it to fund projects that were designed to benefit their territories generally, such as the construction of villages, roads, hospitals, and the like. The next slide, please. One of the best known of these projects is the famous spa Hanau-Wilhelmsbad. The construction started in 1777, lasted for several years. Thomas Jefferson himself visited the spa in 1788 in the company of Friedrich Wilhelm von Geismar, a Hanau officer who had befriended him during his stay in Virginia when he was a prisoner of war. Geismar had become a prisoner as a result of Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga. Jefferson admired the impressive spa that had been built with money paid for soldiers hired to fight against the American revolutionaries. Moreover, subsidy treaties should also be seen as political measures that allowed the rulers of smaller territories within the Holy Roman Empire to maintain a certain degree of power and influence, and in some cases also preserve their dynastic interests and protection and gain protection from foreign threats. Last but not least, these soldiers were not mercenaries, which are soldiers who fight in a foreign army or war for personal profit. They were military units with their own commanders, hired out by their respective rulers to assist Britain in its efforts to put down the American rebellion. The German terms usually used are either Hilfstruppen, Hilfe meaning aiding, or Subsidientruppen, referring to the subsidy payments that the king paid to these rulers. Next slide, please. So how did they end up in the American War? Well, in the spring of 1775, Britain faced a very challenging task, and that was to raise a substantial military force that could be dispatched to America quickly. For various reasons, the king determined that he would not be able to raise a sufficient number of troops at home or within other parts of the empire, including North America. After the failure of his efforts to hire 20,000 Russians, the king turned to several German states for support. And I sometimes try to imagine what it would have been like had the king succeeded in hiring 20,000 Russian troops for the war in America. So the king turned to these German rulers for support as he had done in the past. I should also mention that by the summer of 1775, several German rulers had already reached out to the king, offering their troops for the war in North America. In the end, 6 German territories agreed to hire out their troops. I probably don't have to remind anyone here that Germany, of course, as a nation did not exist at the time. These territories are all part of the Holy Roman Empire, which at the time consisted of several hundred territories, some city-states, some duchies, landgraviates, and so forth. So it's a very fragmented empire. The numbers, hope you can see those numbers on the slide, that are indicated here refer to the total number of troops from these territories that ended up in North America over the course of the war. So the original treaties didn't necessarily specify that number, but when you think about replacements and reinforcement, and in some cases there were additional treaties, that's what we estimate is a number of men, at least soldiers, who went to North America. And you can see by these numbers, the majority of these troops came from Hessen-Kassel and Hessen-Hanau. And that is why the label Hessian has been used since the 1770s to describe all German troops in British service in North America, regardless of origin. However, the subsidy troops and also affiliated civilians never described themselves as Hessians, unless they were actually from Hessen or belonged to a Hessen military unit. So, for example, a member of the Braunschweig or the Waldeck Corps would have never referred to himself as a Hessian. It's important to keep in mind. We use Hessian, people kind of know what we mean, but they're not all Hessians, so to speak. Next slide, please. So although these treaties that were signed, the king and these respective rulers agreed on, varied somewhat in the details, they agreed on the basics. And the slide that I'm showing you here is a printed versions of the cover sheet versions of the treaty with Braunschweig, Hessen-Kassel, and Hessen-Hanau. These are the first 3 treaties that were formally agreed upon. That's in early January of 1776. They were published immediately in 76 in German and also in English in German-speaking countries. So Germans, of course, are very curious about what is happening, what is going on, what are the terms, so they were published early on. The original treaties, much of the text is actually in French. So the basics are, the German units would be commanded by their own officers and subject to their own military law. The German troops would serve on the same terms as British soldiers, including their pay. That was very important. British pay was quite generous for the time, so that was clearly also intended to be an incentive for soldiers to sign up, or for men to sign up. They could only serve in Europe and North America. Britain paid annual subsidy payments to the respective ruler during their time, the time these troops were in British service, and usually also for 1 or 2 years afterwards. It's of course important to keep in mind that in 1776, no one really knew how long the war would last. Britain, I think, certainly assumed it wouldn't last as long as it did last in the end. Britain also covered individual pay, transport to and from America, most of, not all, but most of the equipment, provisions, replacements, and medical care. And as you can probably imagine, keeping track of all of this was very, very challenging, and it got more and more complicated and confusing over the course of the war. In America, the Germans almost always served alongside British troops. We only have a couple of examples where Germans were sent out onto a campaign or expedition of battle without being accompanied by British troops. One example is the Battle of Bennington, for example. Very famous Braunschweiger troops were involved in that. And then we also have Red Bank outside of Philadelphia that is almost entirely consisting of German troops. But that's not the norm. Most of the time, British and Germans, and also provincials, of course, served together. The overall commander was also almost always a British officer. The only exception to that is a brief period of time in New York when Clinton was gone and Knyphausen, the Hessian commander, stepped in for a couple of months, but that's it. The overall commander of any kind of action was always a British officer. These military units were accompanied by hundreds of civilian employees, including medical personnel, chaplains, servants, laborers. And to the army also belonged a significant number of women, including single women and also wives of soldiers who served in a range of essential roles. For example, laundresses or maids who were employed in the field hospitals. Next slide, please. And also children. The presence and role of women and children is not as well documented as one would wish, but there are plenty of records that shed light on their presence and at least serve as anecdotal evidence that they were there. The document, obviously, you're not be able to read the fine print, so to speak, but the document that I used here to illustrate the kind of records that we do have available that does serve as evidence that women and children were with the German troops in America, that women and children went from Germany to America with these troops. This is here an example. It's an embarkation list. It is a recruiting transport of Braunschweig soldiers that went to Canada. And what this list includes is all the individuals that were on board the ship, this particular transport, when it left Stade, which is a port in Germany, in April of 1779. And then there's a column that lists in terms of numbers, people that were on board the ship when it was in Quebec, outside of Quebec, in October of 1779. And you can see on this list, there are, of course, a bunch of men, there's recruits, there's a chaplain or a company surgeon, there's a number of individuals, And there are also 14 women and 2 children on board when it left Stade. The middle column lists people that had died. There are 5 or 6 men and 1 child that did not survive the voyage. And on the right column, you have members listed as sick. What's, I think, interesting about this is that the vessel left Stade with 2 children on board. But when it arrived in Quebec, it still had 2 children on board, but they're not the same children. One of the children had died, but another one had been born on the voyage. And that was not unusual at all. So you think about it, soldiers, of course, including enlisted men, often when they were married and they had pregnant wives, wanted to take their wives along, especially when they came from very modest economic circumstances because their families depended on them. So that did happen. So when I look at a document like that, I see stories. You know, I think about it. These are people that have different expectations. They have very different backgrounds. They have very different roles in the military, in these military units. And they also have different experiences. Obviously, some died. The company surgeon deserted, which is not common for a company surgeon during this time. And then we also here have, by the way, a soldier and his wife who got chased away from the regiment. Doesn't say what they did, but there was some kind of transgression. They got some kind of punishment, and that was to get chased away from dishonorably discharged, basically. So a variety of experiences in this single document. The very first treaties, including the one with Hessen-Kassel, were formally concluded in January 1776, as I already mentioned. The rulers had literally only a few weeks to assemble and outfit substantial corps. Hessen-Kassel's original contract is for 12,000 men. I mean, that's a lot of troops that they'd get ready, outfit, prepare for transport, then organize the transport, taken to England and from there to America. Do not imagine that these rulers had these military units ready to go. They had to recruit for this war in North America a substantial proportion of these regiments. So Braunschweig is a good example. What Braunschweig did is you took existing regiments and kind of broke them up, used experienced soldiers sort of as a foundation on which, and then build up regiments that could go to America. But that meant that you did have some experienced soldiers, which of course you want, but a lot of the men had to be recruited specifically for this war. It was not that difficult to recruit the officer corps. There were plenty of men, ambitious soldiers, veterans of other wars, officers in German regiments who applied to be part of this, who wanted to go to America. And that is mainly to advance their military careers, of course. If you're a career soldier and officer, there's not a lot of opportunity to advance in times of peace. So for some of these men, it clearly offered an opportunity to get ahead. The territories used a variety of conscription schemes to raise the troops, such as enrollment lists or requiring districts to raise a certain number of men. Regardless of the kind of scheme they used to recruit the troops, the territories were essentially looking for the same type of men to fill up their regiments. They had to be physically and mentally fit to withstand the demands of military service in America. Age was important. And turned out that the typical age for a German soldier was in his 20s, but we have young men, basically children, who are, we would call them teenagers. They're maybe 14, 15, 16 years old. And we also have men who are in their 50s or even in their 60s, which is considered quite old at the time. There should be at least 5 foot 4 inches tall. That requirement was relaxed over the course of the war as it became more and more difficult to recruit or enlist the required number of men. And ideally, they were single or, if married, without children. In other words, have as few dependents as possible. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a recruiting certificate. This is from Braunschweig. This is Johann Friedrich Hennig, who's a rope maker by trade. Recruited, he got as a bounty 5 thaler, which was roughly £1 at the time. Just for context, the servants' wages at the time in Braunschweig was probably about 1 or 1.5 thaler a month. So this is quite an attractive incentive for someone to sign up. I do want to draw your attention to the date of this, February 1782. When we think of the Hessians, we think of their role in the American War. The focus often is at the beginning of the war, 76 in particular. That's when most of the treaties were signed, not all of them. But it is important to keep in mind that Britain, the German rulers, actively recruited Germans for the war in North America well into 1782. In other words, the year after Yorktown. We think Yorktown War is over. Well, that's not what the British thought, apparently, and that's certainly not what the German rulers hoped, because it's a source of money, of course. So we have troop transports leaving Germany in 1782 with several thousand soldiers, which is interesting and remarkable, I think, important to keep in mind. And he was one of them. All of the territories also used various exemptions that were designed to exclude men from military service, certain men, only sons, for example, property owners, laborers in essential industries, like people who worked in mines. These people were not supposed to go into service. Generally speaking, recruiters were supposed to enlist foreigners or native men deemed expendable, men whose departure for America was regarded as having little or no economic disadvantages for the territory, or whose absence may have even been seen as beneficial for the local community. I'll give you a couple of examples. In February 1781, Katharina Maria Hosbach from Hessen-Kassel pleaded with the Landgraf, her ruler, to send her husband Johannes to America. She was a widow with 4 daughters from a previous marriage, and had married this man, on the advice of others, as she wrote, and it had initially gone well. But then he had started to behave badly, not pursued his profession, and not contributed anything to the household while demanding her to prepare good food and drink. Katharina was the proprietor of a tavern, but his bad behavior discouraged people from lodging with her. He was a danger to her 4 daughters, she said, and he never even went to church. In short, she asked to have him sent to America in order to, quote, improve him and lead him to a better lifestyle. To her disappointment, the request was rejected. Why? Their neighbors testified not only that the wife was in part to blame for their domestic troubles, but also that he was the only wig maker in town. He was needed at home. Another example, in early 1782, a widow in Hanau had more luck of having her son sent to America, largely because her neighbors agreed that he was a danger to the community. She pleaded with Hanau's ruler to enlist her son. He was 24 years old. His name was Georg Christian Vogt. She hoped that he would be sent or recruited into the Free Corps that was scheduled to go to America that spring. She was a poor widow, she said, and she claimed that he was a violent man who had attacked her with an axe during an argument. An investigation revealed that he had also stolen tobacco from a field and burglarized several homes. He often came home drunk and wandered around his attic with a burning candle. The neighbors were worried that one day he'll burn the house down. In the testimony, the mother described him as a Taugenichts, good for nothing, who had already received all sorts of punishments without improving his ways. Sending him to America would not only help her, but also benefit the community and hopefully straighten him out too. The son, not surprisingly, rejected all of these charges and accusations. He admitted that he had been angry, but he never intended to hurt or kill her. She called him a good for nothing. He, in the testimony, ended up calling her a Seelenverkäufer, seller of souls. To make a long story short, Georg was ordered to go to America. I have not been able to confirm definitively whether he made it. I do not want to give you the impression that the Corps was filled with petty criminals, by the way, or troublemakers, but this is the war did offer some in families and communities an opportunity to get rid of, troublesome sons or husbands. Ideally, of course, the men volunteered, but it was challenging to meet the need with volunteers alone. Files in German archives document cases of young men who refused to report for mustering, potential recruits who escaped into foreign territories during recruiting season, recruits who deserted or mutinied, and families who pleaded with their ruler to exempt husbands or sons for a variety of reasons. The main objection of men to enlist appears to have been the prospect of serving in a foreign war on a distant continent against an enemy that had done them no harm. As mentioned earlier, Britain had hired German auxiliaries on multiple occasions. However, they had never served outside of Europe. This was a first. As a result, local officials struggled to recruit suitable men. At the same time, I think also not surprisingly, there were reasons why a man from the Holy Roman Empire may have volunteered for service in America. Recruits went willingly or volunteered for an opportunity to improve their condition, their economic condition, gain free passage to America, advance their military career, study the American land and people, or escape challenging circumstances. The German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe recalled in 1821 that in 1775, America used to be the El Dorado of people who found themselves in a difficult situation. Some clearly also went in search of adventure. 22-year-old recruit Stefan Popp from Ansbach-Bayreuth recorded in his journal that many of the recruits around him were, quote, filled with grief and some in sorrow, while I, and those in my way of thinking, were enjoying the prospect of leaving our mother country for the new world. In short, the people that we lumped together as Hessians were a very diverse group of individuals, different backgrounds, and with a wide range of motivations and expectations. Next slide. Ultimately, the German troops ended up widely dispersed along the eastern seaboard, from Canada, including Quebec and Nova Scotia, to West Florida and even Cuba. And they participated in every major campaign and countless minor military encounters. And I want to emphasize that because, again, when we think of Hessians, my experience is most people first think of Trenton, very famous, of course, maybe Saratoga, then Yorktown, which probably not coincidentally are all American victories, all ended in the capture of thousands of German soldiers. But it is really important that these German soldiers participated, they were all across the seaboard and participated in many, many more military engagements. And so just reducing it to these three major events, I think, does them a disservice and kind of misrepresents what their experience was, including their experiences on Rhode Island, which is often completely ignored. Next slide, please. So they're all over the place, and I should also emphasize that we are extremely fortunate to have a huge body of records that were penned by members of the German Corps during the war in America. The slide here just shows you 6 representative examples. The top left is a letter, an envelope of a letter that a Braunschweig soldier sent home from Quebec to his sister. So we have quite a lot of private correspondence written by soldiers or chaplains and other members of the Corps. The one in the middle is a list. We have tons of lists. Think about this as a kind of a transaction, right? The soldier, the armed, equipped, hopefully trained soldier is essentially a commodity that is rented out to another ruler in exchange for money. So there is a lot of record keeping that goes with it, as you can imagine. So we have a lot of lists of people and also of stuff. The list here that is included is it's hard to make out, but it is actually a list of a regiment that happened to be in Rhode Island. Top right is a church record. This is a baptismal record from Braunschweig. So we have these other records. The chaplains kept journals in America. They recorded baptism, they recorded deaths, of course, or they recorded marriages. This baptismal record recorded the baptism of 6 black drummers who had returned to Germany with the German Corps in 1783 and were baptized in the garrison church then in Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel with 6 veterans of the American War, German veterans, serving as their sponsors. We have printed material. This is a journal of the voyage of a Waldeck officer from New York to Pensacola, West Florida. Described the journal with a stopover on Jamaica, sent it back to Germany, and it was printed during the war. So we have some printed material that was written by members of the Corps in America for German-speaking Europeans. There's tremendous interest, of course. German-speaking Europeans want to know what's going on. So these German soldiers really serve as almost like foreign correspondents. They report back, and some of the stuff is printed. Then we have regimental journals. This is the cover of the Regiment von Ditford, which was also in Rhode Island. The Landgraf of Hessen-Kassel sent essentially orders to America, which were conveyed by General Knyphausen when he was in charge of the Hessian troops. It's in the journals. He's sending directives to all the quartermasters of the regiments, telling them to keep journals and document each and every event that happens to the regiments. We are very, very fortunate that we have a lot of these regiments in German archives to this day. And then the bottom left is a diary by a soldier. We have not a lot, but we do have some personal diaries, which of course are particularly interesting and often very detailed. This one is by an Ansbach soldier, a grenadier named Beuchel. So this is just representative examples. I'm not even showing you maps. And these people also collected objects that they took back to Germany. So there is a lot of interest, curiosity, a desire to document what's happening by officials, of course, but also by these individuals for private purposes. And for my book, I relied heavily on these kind of accounts. I really set out to understand more what was it like for these individuals in America. They went to a place that they knew little about. Most of these Germans have no idea what the war is about. And they've certainly never been to America before. And I was curious, how did they describe the war, the land, and the people? And I visited around 24 archives in Europe and also in America to research these records. And again, it's a huge volume, which is wonderful, but also kind of overwhelming at times that we have this stuff. And I would say, that this kind of material did help broaden knowledge of North America among German-speaking Europeans in the late 18th century. As I mentioned, they really are important sources of information. They really shape to some extent what German-speaking Europeans think of North America and the war. But I would also add that these records are important for us today to get, I think, a more not necessarily a better understanding, but a fuller understanding of the Revolutionary War experience. The next slide, please. So what did they think of America? Well, initially the Germans did not have much respect for the Americans as a worthy enemy. Of course, as I mentioned, many soldiers were young men who had been recruited specifically for the war in America. They were not necessarily more experienced in warfare than their American counterparts. Certainly, most of them had never participated in battle before. However, from the perspective of someone belonging to a highly hierarchical and disciplined army that stressed the neat and orderly appearance of all of its members, from private to general, the Americans did not even look like soldiers. For example, German soldiers were either clean-shaven or they had neatly groomed mustaches. Many of the Americans appeared to be unshaven, thus giving them the appearance of Spitzbuben or scoundrels, rather than soldiers. Shortly after his arrival on Long Island, a Hessian wrote in a letter to Kassel that he did not have a razor. He was embarrassed that at times he had a beard like a rebel. Moreover, the Hessian troops, well uniformed, at least during the early phase of the war, found that many Americans were dressed in, quote, torn rags of different colors, or the miserable outfits typically worn by poor farmers. For the most part, moreover, they found that American soldiers were undisciplined and lacked loyalty. They were cowards who ran at the first sight of the enemy. From the German perspective, Washington's retreats in the fall of 1776, his refusal to meet the British in a large-scale battle, were not based on strategic decisions. Rather, they were due to the spinelessness of his soldiers. Some officers contemptuously compared the war to a hunt. According to the Hessian chaplain Becker, the Hessians were charging after, quote, countless bands of gypsies, as he described the American troops. And at the Battle of Harlem Heights in the fall of 1776, the American Colonel Joseph Reed was enraged when British and Hessians, and I quote, sounded their bugles in a most insulting manner, as is usual after a fox chase. It took the Germans a while to abandon their preconceived notions about the proper appearance and behavior of an army. Indeed, the Germans did realize early on that the American war was unlike any other military conflict they had known. First, of course, there was the terrain and the climate. The troops in Canada, for example, had to learn how to row boats and march in snowshoes. In a letter from Quebec to his brother in Braunschweig, dated May 1781, Lieutenant Auguste de Roy wrote that every soldier had gotten used to marching in snowshoes. And I quote, "I wish you could see them marching like this. You would be filled with admiration for your countrymen." And of course, the terrain and climate in places like West Florida and Georgia required different kinds of adjustments, such as dealing with the heat and the humidity and the mosquitoes. Regardless of location, German troops frequently and throughout the war complained about physically exhausting marches and rough terrain and inclement weather that they were not used to and that rendered campaigning exceptionally challenging. Second, they had to get used to an American way of fighting. For example, they had trouble distinguishing between friend and foe, between rebel and loyalist. And the distinction between civilian and combatants was also often unclear. Moreover, the Americans tended to fight in what the Germans described as very unconventional ways. This included their strategy of ambushing an unsuspecting enemy. In 1777, a private wrote from Rhode Island to his parents in Hessen that the Americans were not like regular soldiers at all, but, quote, more like robbers and thieves, and that they hide in hedges and bushes and shoot so well when they are able that they hit every time. Although this behavior was seen as dishonorable, even unacceptable, it also rendered these fighters into effective opponents. German troops had to get used to this type of irregular warfare carried out by what they saw as a ragtag bunch of farmers, how to protect themselves from ambushes, and also how to conduct them. In the meantime, the American image of the Hessian soldiers was ambivalent. On the one hand, they were ruthless mercenaries, plunderer, savage, not unlike Native Americans, brutal toward enemy soldiers and worse, innocent civilians, including women and children. This image prevailed during the summer and fall of 1776, as the Patriots tried to motivate American men to join the rebellion and defend their communities, their homes, and their families from these invaders. In broadsides, newspaper accounts, and in private correspondence, the Hessian was consistently depicted as violent and as merciless. And I would say that that image to some extent persists to this day. But on the other hand, the Hessian was also depicted as a poor victim of tyranny, forced by greedy princes to fight in a war that did not concern him. He was deserving of pity. Based on the assumption that these soldiers had been enlisted against their will, and that they lacked loyalty to the British cause, the Americans believed that they would gladly lay down their weapons and settle in America if only given a chance. And in fact, the Patriots began to publish offers of liberty and property for foreign deserters as early as the summer of 1776. And this is the earliest known broadside. It's from in the Hessian state archives. So these are German language archives drafted by a committee in Congress that offered, in this case, 50 acres and religious freedom and all the rights of native-born Americans. The capture of as many as 1,000 Hessians in Trenton, Christmas 1776, reinforced this image of them as innocent victims, and the Patriots, after that date, actively cultivated it over the next few years. Trenton, of course, was a humiliating defeat. However, The Germans' first year in North America started off quite successfully, important to keep that in mind, and that of course included the occupation of Rhode Island. The British landed in December 1776, as I'm sure you all know, when General Howe sent General Clinton with as many as maybe 7,100 troops to take possession of Newport in order to establish a base for the British Navy there. His troops were made up roughly equal parts British and Germans. German troops consisted of several Hessen-Kassel regiments, next slide please, including the regiment von Ditford, all under the command of General Friedrich Wilhelm von Lossberg. Two of these regiments, and I'll mention some as I go along, two of these regiments, Prinz Karl and Leib, returned to New York a few months later in May 1777. They participated in Howe's expedition to Philadelphia. The two Ansbach-Bayreuth regiments arrived in Rhode Island in the summer of 1778. Along with the four remaining Hessian regiments, they would remain in Rhode Island until 1779. A nice map here that indicates where exactly they landed. So these troops were accompanied by a considerable number of women and children, including unmarried women and the wives of soldiers who fulfilled a range of roles, as I already mentioned. That was very common at the time. Evidence of their presence in Rhode Island, however, is incomplete and largely anecdotal. For example, we know from a journal in the regiment von Huyn in the spring of 1779, we know of a departure from Rhode Island of several soldiers in the company of 2 women and 2 children belonging to Hessen and Ansbach regiments. And that's the kind of source that usually gives us clue. Oh, obviously there are women and children with the regiments, but unfortunately they're usually not listed on reports of regiments, so we have to kind of piece it together. It is estimated that the Hessian regiments included more than 50 women and more than 40 children, but that's again just an estimate. We do know that at the evacuation in October 79, the Ansbach and Bayreuth regiments included 66 women and 29 children. So we have numbers, and I think based on this information, we can probably say with reasonable certainty that there were dozens of women and children with the German Corps in Rhode Island during their time here. So, Corps lands the troops, men, dozens of women and children with them. The journal of the regiment von Ditford describes the arrival of the fleet as a very impressive spectacle. And if you bring up the image, it's an image of the British fleet, except it's not the British fleet off the coast of Rhode Island. To my knowledge, there is no nice painting of that, even though there are some floating around the internet. So for illustrative purposes, I had an image of the fleet off the coast of New York. The journal explains in great detail what happened. The transports and the warships had been ordered to raise their flags. In anticipation of resistance, the warships were sailing along both coasts up the bay. The journal says, the amazing appearance of the fleet is hard to imagine. It must have been truly impressive. The fleet, as you also know, here it is, did not face any opposition. According to the journal of the regiment Prinz Karl, from their transports, the Hessians saw a few rebels on shore who took off as soon as they spotted the approaching fleet. The Ditford journal confirms that the troops, and I quote, debarked on the 8th, that's the 8th of December, in the morning, and without any resistance during the night, the enemy had departed from the city of Newport and the island and had taken all of the cattle with them to Providence. In a letter to Hessen, Captain Christian Friedrich von Orff reported that they had taken possession of Rhode Island. He said, Besitznahme, possession of Rhode Island. He says he could not call it a conquest, considering that the rebels had run away like villains. In light of the enemy's overwhelming force, the estimated 600 American soldiers who had been stationed on the island had indeed abandoned their fortifications. The experience reinforced the Hessians' perception that they were facing a weak and timid enemy. So within days of dropping anchor in Narragansett Bay In late 76, the troops had occupied Newport and the surrounding countryside on Aquidneck Island, which in contemporary records is referred to as Rhode Island. And a few days later, they also took Jamestown or Connecticut Island. Next slide menu. To their distress, however, the troops initially had to camp in the open. I mean, the timing is not perfect. To arrive in Rhode Island in December is probably not a great idea. The Ditford Regiment, for example, marched to Middleton, where it spent the first couple of nights outside, enduring strong and stormy wind, as the journal recorded, and lots of snow. 2 days later, they received tents, and on the 12th, their regiment was assigned homes that had been abandoned by their owners. They evidently remained encamped in tents, suffering from the cold, rain, and snow until around December 26, when they moved into their assigned winter quarters, blissfully unaware of their comrades' defeat at Trenton that very same day, at least for a few more days until a packet boat delivered the sad news. 3 Hessian and 2 British regiments were eventually quartered in Newport, while the other Hessian and British regiments, for the most part, moved to a number of outposts on the island. This map, I just want to indicate, if you can read it, I indicated location of these regiments based on what is a German map, what the legend tells us. But I do want to point out that it's not that all the regiments were all together on these outposts. That's where many of the men were, but we know that they were all over, and many of these, including especially the officers, and especially during the winter seasons, were actually in Newport. But it's a nice German map that also gives you the location of what they're called the feindlichen Batterien, or the enemy batteries. The Germans described Newport and the rest of the island in very, very favorable terms. Orff thought it was the most pleasant land he could imagine, or one could imagine. He claimed that it was known as the Pearl of New England. Due to its healthy climate, people were suffering from various ailments, came from far and wide for rest and for cure. Next slide, please. At the time, the city had about 1,000 dwellings, around a dozen houses of worship, a courthouse, library, several public buildings, most of which were clustered along the wharves. The Hessians noted the variety of religious denominations. However, after several months in North America, this diversity no longer struck them as unusual. All were impressed by the province's evident wealth, which they rightly attributed to Newport's importance as a port city. They were convinced that Britain's control of the city would cripple the colonists' profitable smuggling trade and as a result ruin the colonies. Captain Orff, for example, predicted that the Americans' inability to import supplies from places like the West Indies, Holland, or France would be their death, his word. Although members of the German Corps often struggled to get the large picture, to comprehend British strategy throughout the war, they understood that the British aimed to control major ports like New York, Philadelphia, and Newport, and subsequently also Charleston and Savannah, at least in part to disrupt trade and damage the colonial economy. In the case of Newport, this effort proved successful, at least in regard to the local economy. The British presence not only hurt trade, it also drove many locals out of town. It was said that many of Newport's estimated 9,000 inhabitants fled from the city, presumably because, quote, some evil rumors about the Hessians. According to a Hessian-authored account, they quickly returned when they realized these stories were untrue. In reality, many actually never returned. In fact, Newport never fully recovered its dominance as a port as a result of the British occupation. Indeed, for most of the presence of the army in Newport, there was a lot of plundering, destruction of property, and restrictions on trade, all of which caused much hardship for many inhabitants. The winter that year was particularly cold. As already mentioned, many of the troops had to camp in tents until more suitable dwellings could be secured. From the very beginning, moreover, the army experienced shortages of essentials, including fresh food and firewood. Locals were charging exorbitant prices for wares such as meat, fish, and grain. As a result, both locals and soldiers broke down fences and robbed properties, despite the efforts by commanding officers to curb such behavior. Even the use of armed guards to protect properties from looters was not always effective. For example, only a few days after the arrival of the army, a British private who was guarding a farm shot 2 soldiers belonging to the regiment von Ditford. One of them was mortally wounded. The private was court-martialed after the Hessian's commanding officer filed a formal complaint that he had shot this man, quote, without pretext or reason. However, during the trial, several British soldiers confirmed that Hessian soldiers had repeatedly stolen from the farm and that the guard had been ordered to shoot pillagers. The man was acquitted. The troops who were able to lodge in Newport were among the more fortunate. Many were quartered in abandoned homes or they seized dwellings from their occupants. They also enjoyed a fairly uneventful winter season. Everything is quiet, Orff wrote from Newport in February 1777. The officer's diversion during the winter season included balls, concerts, and similar social gatherings, many of which included local women. In early 1778, Captain Friedrich von der Malzburg of the von Ditford Regiment noted in his diary that he had hosted a supper for 9 officers with an equal number of women. The dancing did not stop until 4 a.m. For the troops who were stationed at the outposts, the winter season was less pleasant, mostly because they were subjected to constant harassment by the Americans. Rebels repeatedly dared to land on the island and plunder properties. According to the Hessian quartermaster Kleinschmidt, the successful attack on Trenton had made the Hessians more alert and the Americans much bolder. In a letter to his family in German, Private Jungheim Steller of the von Hün Regiment described guard duty as particularly dangerous because the Americans frequently snuck up and fired on the posts. He thought that the people did not like the Hessians because they felt that the army took away their rights wherever it went. In early 1778, he wrote in a letter to his family that, and I quote, "It is very dangerous here. I just don't know if I will arrive home healthy or not. I hope there is peace soon and the gruesome blood spilling among the Hessians ends, otherwise not many will return to the fatherland." The fact that 2 Hessian regiments, Leib and Prinz Karl, and 1 British regiment were sent back to New York indicates that spring indicates that the British did not think that the Americans posed a serious threat to their control of Rhode Island. The next slide. As we all know, of course, the only major military action that took place in Rhode Island during the war occurred the following year, 6 months after the Hessian private had expressed his hope for peace in a letter to his family. In 1778, the Americans and French chose Newport as the target of their first Allied attack on the British. A French fleet under Comte d'Estaing had departed from France in April in order to provide assistance to the Americans. After abandoning plans to blockade Philadelphia and New York, d'Estaing proceeded to Rhode Island. The British immediately dispatched around 2,000 troops from New York, including the Ansbach-Bayreuth regiments, as reinforcements. Some of these would be stationed on Connecticut Island. In anticipation of an attack, the troops in Rhode Island began to make preparation for a, quote, welcome, as the Ditford Regimental Journal put it. It marked the beginning of a period of fatiguing toil. Next slide, please. These are 3 plans for fortifications that they're in the Clinton papers in the Clements Library at the University of Michigan. There are quite a few of these examples of the kind of stuff that these soldiers either repaired or fortified or set up to build. So for them, this was a period of fatiguing toil. Most of the men were withdrawn to Newport, where they built or fortified defenses, cut down trees, burned a number of houses, and sunk vessels in the harbor. Next, please. In late July, the French fleet sailed into Narragansett Bay. The plan was to put Newport under siege and capture the garrison. The French were to attack from the sea, while the Americans, which were commanded by General John Sullivan, launched attacks on British and German posts from the interior. This is just a page from the Ditford Journal that lists all the French vessels that had arrived. On August 8th, the French fleet sailed towards the harbor under heavy bombardment from the batteries. After 2 French vessels succeeded in entering the port, the troops on Connecticut Island were ordered to retreat to Newport. However, and I'm giving you a very abbreviated version of what's happening here. Just in time, relieved in the form of the British fleet under Admiral Howe. The 2 powers prepared for what would have been, I think, the most significant naval battle of the war. Some of the soldiers on land were very excited about the prospect of witnessing a sea battle. However, a massive storm left the fleet scattered and damaged, and both sailed off. The German troops did not believe that the threat was over. Sullivan continued to expect support from the French, and he prepared for the siege as planned. There were rumors that the enemy force was overwhelming. Captured Americans reported that Sullivan had as many as 22,000 men under his command, twice or probably 3 times as the actual number. To make matters worse, stormy weather ravaged the British camps, tearing down tents, ruining ammunition. The grueling labor and siege-like conditions took a toll on the Germans. During these days, the Ansbach and Bayreuth regiments experienced a marked uptick in the number of desertions. More than 12 men absconded over a period of 7 days alone in the middle of August. Assuming that the return of the French fleet was imminent, the men were extremely anxious. In reality, discouraged by the departure of the French fleet, many Americans were abandoning their posts. But the Germans, of course, did not know this at the time. And when on August 20th, several French vessels reappeared off the coast, they were very worried. 2 days later, they discovered to their relief that these French vessels had apparently only returned to collect some troops and equipment that they had earlier left on Connecticut Island. D'Estaing had decided to take his fleet to Boston for repairs. When it became clear that the French fleet would not be coming back, the Americans withdrew to the north of the island. The British pursued them. One column was made up of British regiments, while the other was comprised of German provincial troops and led by Lossberg. The Americans, hidden behind walls and in cornfields, inflicted serious damage on the advancing corps. Captain von der Malzburg, for example, suffered a slight injury to his hand. His dog was shot dead. People always feel sorry for the dog that gets shot.
Do you know what the dog's name was?
I don't. It's maybe in his journal. Okay. With support from the Navy, the British stepped up the attack. On the evening of August 30th, under cover of darkness, Sullivan withdrew with forces to Bristol and Tiverton. The British did not pursue them. This was a costly battle. The American casualties numbered around 200, while the British lost about 280 men. Probably as many as half of them were German. By the end of the month, the island was largely cleared of enemy troops. A detachment of around 400 Hessians was ordered to Connecticut Island. The rest were stationed in Newport and the surrounding area. The inhabitants expressed their gratitude to the Hessian privates and non-commissioned officers who had been wounded in the battle with gifts of woolen socks and nightshirts. The next. Mm-hmm. A satirical poem by an unknown author, German most likely, recorded in the personal diary of Captain von der Malzburg, ridiculed the Americans for the lack of courage and tendency to take flight in the face of the enemy. It's like a 12-stanza poem. The poem quipped that the French had apparently, quote, forgotten how often British drums and Hessian mustaches and hats had made the Yankee sweat in fear. In anticipation of the campaign, the poem reads, the Yankee had bravely put on his hunting shirt, loaded his rifle, and sworn to defend Rhode Island regardless of how many enemies he faced. But then, when D'Estaing left, Yankee departed too, in typical Yankee Doodle custom. Indeed, the poem continued, D'Estaing's exit was the perfect excuse for the Americans to retreat. The whole poem, it's a great poem, just making fun of the whole idea of having a joint campaign with Americans. Of course, in reality, the troops under Sullivan, including most famously the 1st Rhode Island Regiment known as the Black Regiment, because many of its members were black, had put up fierce resistance and inflicted serious damage, largely due to the American way of fighting that had by then become familiar familiar to the German troops. The main feature, again, of the strategy was firing at the enemy from concealed positions, such as walls and hedges. I think it is not a coincidence that the poem essentially identifies the Yankee as a rifleman. Unfortunately, the winter 78-79 turned out to be exceptionally miserable for the troops and the residents in Newport due to a dangerous combination of dismal quarters, poor provisions, and severe weather. A brutal snowstorm that struck in late December became known as the Hessian Storm on account of several German soldiers who were among the many individuals who perished. Snowdrifts were said to be as high as 16 feet. The snow was so high, in fact, one Hessian explained, that people had to leave their houses out their second-story windows. According to the Bayreuth soldier Stefan Popp, 9 soldiers, 1 woman, and 2 small children froze to death, and around 24 individuals suffered severe frostbite in their hands and feet. The Bünau regiment lost 3 men, at least 3 men, to the severe cold. According to another Hessian officer, even local elders could not remember a winter that cold. The Ansbach soldier Beuschel wrote in his diary that the year 1779 began on a very sad note indeed. The conditions were made worse by the inability of British vessels to deliver fresh provisions for several weeks. Popp recorded in his diary that they had, and I quote, little bread, and that made of rice and Indian cornmeal. Instead of meat, bad fish, and of that not enough to thrive on and too much to die of starvation. We had to bake our own bread out of wretched corn. According to the Ditford Journal, the men were suffering terribly. It was not until the end of January that the long-awaited transports carrying fresh provisions finally arrived. The troops also received unanticipated relief from another source, the arrival of around 100 refugees from New York, who immediately set out to plunder local farms, driving stolen cattle to the army, since no one else could pay the inflated prices for the oxen and other animals. Despite this relief, the Ansbach soldier Beuschel noted in his diary in March 1779 that 173 men belonging to his regiment were suffering from scurvy. Ultimately, the troops were settling in, and by late spring, the soldiers were planting gardens in plots they had been assigned. Locals were impressed with their diligence and hard work, especially since the soldiers could not know whether they would ever be able to reap the fruits of their labor. And indeed, of course, their time in Rhode Island was coming to an end. In the summer of 79, a British, a provincial, and the regiment Landgraf were ordered to Long Island in preparation for a raid along the Connecticut coast. The rest of the garrison remained largely inactive until October, when they received orders to abandon the province and return to New York. In October, a fleet of more than 100 vessels carrying the troops, women, and children, along with a number of loyalists, set sail for New York. Among these individuals was a number of black men, women, and children who had sought refuge with the army. We cannot say with certain how many black individuals from Rhode Island were with the army at that time. However, we know that at least one of them, a formerly enslaved man named Caesar Nichols, had been recruited as a drummer in the Leib Regiment. That's a regiment that had left earlier already. He may have been 15 or 16 at the time. The records are not reliable. Entirely consistent with contemporary European use of blacks in European military units, black musicians outfitted in exotic uniforms added considerable prestige to German regiments. In fact, for the duration of the war, German military units in North America actively recruited black men, especially as musicians, especially as drummers, but also as laborers, and in rare instances as privates. Black men and women also served the regiments in many less formal roles, including personal servants, laborers, and cooks. It is challenging to determine whether blacks ended up with German regiments as voluntary recruits or as plunder. The army routinely seized enslaved people during foraging expeditions, and we do have written evidence that black children were sent to Germany during the war as gifts. Moreover, some of them eventually deserted or were returned to individuals who claimed them as their property. In other words, some of these individuals did not stay with the army for long. Nevertheless, whether they were attached to German military units voluntarily or involuntarily, whether in formal or informal roles, from the beginning of the German Corps' presence in North America, black men, women, and children were a familiar presence in the encampments, and that was also the case in Rhode Island. Moreover, at least 200 black men and women and children, probably more, but we have documented 200, traveled with the Corps to Germany when the British evacuated the new nation in 1783. This included the drummer Caesar Nichols, as well as formerly enslaved women, also named Nichols, her first name is not recorded, and a young woman named Catherine Townsend, who claimed to be free, all of them from Newport. They accompanied the Light Regiment when it sailed to Germany in the fall of '83, and they settled in Germany. So to conclude, although the German troops at the evacuation were looking forward to participating in the next campaign, and many of them did go south, for example, they were puzzled why Britain had decided to give up Rhode Island in the fall of '79. The British occupation, of course, had lasted from 76 to 1779. During that time, the troops had successfully withstood persistent harassment by the Americans, and more importantly, had compelled an American-French force to abandon a siege of Newport. Indeed, the very first French-American joint expedition had been a humiliating failure. The second joint expedition, by the way, was even more humiliating, the failed siege of Savannah in the fall of '79. And then, of course, this third effort was a little bit more successful. That was Yorktown in 1781. But we have to remember, the first couple of tries didn't really work out so well. And that's certainly what the Germans recognized. However, it seemed to them as though all the hard work and sacrifices had been in vain. Moreover, thousands of British and German troops were in Rhode Island during the period of the war that was marked by the defeats at Trenton and Princeton, the surrender of Burgoyne's army at Saratoga, the occupation and evacuation, also puzzling to many Germans, of Philadelphia, and the beginning of the Southern Campaign. With the advantage of hindsight, at least, it seems as though these troops in Rhode Island could have been used more effectively elsewhere. So the Germans in Rhode Island wondered what exactly had been accomplished with this campaign. The Americans and the French fleet had been allowed to escape, and now the island was essentially, next slide please, was essentially surrendered to the enemy. Hard to see, but it's depicting the arrival of Rochambeau. And indeed, within days of the British departure, the Americans took possession of Newport, and of course, it eventually served as a naval base for the French, and it was from here that French troops under Rochambeau set out for the march to Yorktown in the summer of 1781. Thank you.
We have one question from one person named John. John asks, where is the journal of the regiment, the Ditfurk, located? Okay,
that's a great question. So all my slides have citations also when you put this up later so people can see. So the regimental journals, most of, if not all of the regimental journals from Hessen-Kassel are in the, what is known as the Moorhardsche Bibliothek in Kassel. It's a rare books library that's affiliated with the University of Kassel. And I should also mention that the regimental journals over the last couple of years have been digitized. They have not been translated, but they're digitized. So they are in this old German script, but if you can search online, you can, their catalog, you can find them.
Yeah, like some of those.
Yes, the one, that's the one it's fully digitized. Mm-hmm.
Anyone? Any questions?
German soldiers who stayed in this country after the Revolutionary War,
Yeah.
did they become Pennsylvania Dutch?
No. So the Pennsylvania Dutch is, the term Pennsylvania Dutch really refers to Germans or individuals from German-speaking Europe who settled in colonial, mostly Pennsylvania, and who held on to their language and their traditions for a significant period of time. So the Pennsylvania Dutch kind of predates the Revolutionary War. You didn't ask this directly, but I do want to mention something about the Germans that stayed here, because there's, people often wonder, or they're often asked, didn't a lot of people of these troops stay here? So briefly, if we start with 30,000 soldiers, and again, that's sort of the accepted number, it may have actually been more than that, but let's say 30,000, roughly 23,000 or so survived the war. We estimate that maybe 1,200 or so died in combat. Then there may be, 5,600 or so died of disease and accident. That's common for 18th century war. Disease is the biggest killer. So we have 23,000 survivors. 17,000 of them went back to Germany. So the majority of survivors, the vast majority of survivors actually went back to Germany. You have to, I think, remember that although some of these individuals might have found it very tempting to stay here and they might have liked what they saw, and again, many descriptions are very positive. America seems very rich and prosperous to them. They had families back home, they had sometimes property back home, and for many soldiers, staying here meant desertion, and desertion is, so that's that is a risky decision to take. So we have 17,000 or so that go back. An estimated 6,000 or so stay in North America, but probably more than half actually end up in Canada. Britain offered land grants to members of the army who wanted to settle in Quebec and in Nova Scotia and also Ontario. They offered relief and so aid sometimes for a certain period of time. So that was a really attractive option, especially for soldiers from Braunschweig who had already spent basically the entire war in Canada, so they're very familiar with the area. And I would also say for individuals who had doubts about the future of the United States and weren't necessarily excited about, joining a nation that had started a rebellion and fought a war. So there were certainly individuals, I think, who preferred to stay within the British Empire. But of those that ended up in the newly founded United States, a good number, as far as we know, ended up in Pennsylvania and other regions where there already are German-speaking individuals, for, I think, obvious reasons.
Ma'am? May I?
Yes?
Just a point of clarification. This is my own theory as far as I know, and I'm interested in your opinion. Pennsylvania Deutsch has nothing to do with the Netherlands.
Right.
Right.
Dutch comes from the German word for German. Deutsch is the German word for German.
Yes, right. People sometimes think it's Dutch, but it's German. Yes?
Friederike, were the Dutchies back home, were they tracking the war? In other words, like when Trenton happened or when they had casualty lists, were they going back to Kassel and those places? Did they know what was going on over here, or was that just by happenstance?
Could you repeat the question?
The question is, do the people back in Germany know what's going on over here? Is that your question? The what?
During the war.
During the war, yeah. So that's a really great question. So there is a lot of communication back and forth between officials in the respective territories and the officers or clerks or whatever, keeping these kind of records in America. A couple of things to keep in mind. One is there's a significant delay, of course, and even if you say in New York and you want to get a message to Kassel, it could take months for it to get there. But now imagine you're not in New York, but maybe you're in Quebec or you're in West Florida. You can imagine it takes even longer. So there is significant delay. There's also always the chance, and it happened, that vessels get captured or in other words, that communications don't make it back. So they do get information, but they do not get as much information, I would say, as they would like to have. So I have found correspondence from officials from Waldeck, for example, correspondence with the English emissary, the man William Fawcett, who negotiated the treaty, sort of a contact, was basically saying, can you please, where's the regiment? What's happening? We haven't heard anything from them in months, you know, can you give us any news? And at that point, that regiment is in West Florida. And then when they find out that in West Florida, they're very worried about this regiment, because to them, this is not even North America, really. This is like basically the tropics, you know. They've heard that disease is widespread. So information is exchanged, but there are definitely moments when there's frustration that they don't get the news, they don't get reliable news necessarily, and they don't necessarily get reliable news from England either about what's happening to these regiments. It's a huge obstacle, I think, the communication generally. Yeah.
We have another question from Christopher, and it says, it seems that the Ansbach Beirut troops were commonly used as a reserve force during the war and commonly transported on ships instead of marching to places. I know they also mutinied before leaving Germany. Have you ever come across any evidence that the British did not trust the troops from Ansbach Beirut?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So yes, there is a famous mutiny that they're involved in Germany before departure, and it seems as though people in America were aware of that these regiments maybe are a little bit less reliable than some other regiments. So I wouldn't say that they're routinely transported by water then marched, but the one famous example is when the British evacuated Philadelphia, and the Ansbach-Bayer troops are in Philadelphia, as most of you probably know, most of the troops march from Philadelphia to New York, because huge, thousands of men and equipment and civilians. The Ansbach-Bayer troops take the boat. And there is some rumor, I think Washington even comments on that they may have chosen those regiments to go by ship because of fear that they are more likely to desert. So there is some evidence of that. Are they used as reserves? I'm not so sure. They participated, they're with Cornwallis, and they're at Yorktown, you know, and they're in Rhode Island, so I'm not sure if that was a pattern throughout the war. But they did have, I think, a little bit of a reputation as, you know, more likely perhaps to desert when given the opportunity.
I have another comment. Oh, yeah, go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Have you run across anything that talked about what did the Hessians do with their casualties at the Battle of Rhode Island? Like as far as, you know, when they put them in a mass grave, other people said they were
I don't know.
Could you repeat that?
The question is whether I've come across any information about what the Germans did with the casualties at the battle, after the Battle of Rhode Island, whether there were mass graves or anything like that. I don't know. That's a good question. I would have to go back to some. We have a number of diaries, so it's possible that there's something in there, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Right. Did they send their dead back via ship, or they buried
No, yeah.
They buried.
Yeah, there are transports going back with wounded or injured men who are no longer fit for service, but I have never seen anything about the dead people being sent back. They're buried here.
Okay. We have another question from George. Was language a difficulty for the German troops with the locals and their British allies?
Yes, the language barrier is a major factor. I'm glad you asked, George. As far as we know, English was not commonly taught, including at military academies in Germany at the time, at least in Hessen-Kassel. So the vast majority of members of the Corps did not know English. We have some officers who know some English. We even have some officers who served who were in British service before. So they may have picked up some English, but generally speaking, the majority do speak no or little English. And although some, of course, acquired some skills over the course of the war, some even start studying it on the voyage over. They're forward-looking, practice a little English. It is a constant source of frustration. And we have officers who will literally say, I cannot really do my job well because I don't really understand the orders, so I have to rely on, in some cases, some enlisted men who happen to know some English, and then he has to translate, and that undermines morale, you know. So the language barrier is a real problem. When Heister, the first commander of the troops, when he got ready to go to America, he was looking for basically a secretary, and he looked for a secretary who could speak French. Assuming, you know, sort of the lingua franca of the military, French would suffice. It didn't, I don't know, occur to him that it would be helpful for the secretary to know English. Howe had an aide who spoke German. Münchhausen's actually a German. So you learn as the war goes on, but the language barrier is a real problem. It's a very good question.
Okay, and we have one more.
There's one back there. Yeah.
Quick question for you. So, I've heard some different accounts that, you know, the reputation of the Germans was very aggressive. What's the truth really behind that? Do you see this even more aggressive than normal troops, or do you think it's just kind of an image of kind of German soldier with the, you know, the blade, the helmet, the
Yeah.
What would you think on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's very difficult when you're looking through these records of, descriptions of battles or behavior. It can be very challenging to sort out, okay, is this a more or less objective account, or is this basically propaganda? There's a lot of propaganda, especially in '76, where, as I mentioned, the Germans really depicted as these brutal monsters, basically. And did they plunder? Yes. Did they commit atrocities? Yes. But when you read these accounts, it's hard to tell whether incidents that are described in these records are imagined or based on fact. It's a brutal war. I really think that sometimes we forget that too when we think about the Revolutionary War. It is a very violent war. It is a civil war to some extent. The Germans comment on that as well. Were Germans brutal and violent? I think, yeah. Were there more so than other participants? I'm not so sure. You know, that's just my opinion. I do think that my impression when I read accounts or when you see stuff online and so forth is that some of the image that we have of these 18th century soldiers is colored by two things. A, the Prussian army, although they were not Prussian. In fact, Prussia was opposed to all of this, but this image of the Prussian army, and then I think also the image of the 20th century German army that we have is obviously one of a very brutal, horrible military. So I think that's colored a little bit the image of a German military generally, going back to the 18th century and even earlier. That's my impression when I read these accounts.
I have one comment from John. He says, not a question, but he says my direct ancestor was Lieutenant Arthur Franz Ferdinand von
Bardeleben. Okay, that's great.
5th Fourth Regiment.
Yes.
He said that he knew a lot about his activities when the regiment was in Charleston, South Carolina, but nothing about the Battle of Rhode Island. And he wanted to say thank you for the presentation, for making it open. He said that he understood that this relative resigned his commission in 1781 and remained in South Carolina.
Oh, well, there we go. Excellent. That's great. That's great. You know, over the course of my work and sharing my work, I've met quite a few people that have that have ancestors, you know, and there are all these different stories. So it's wonderful, and I'm glad he could log on. Yeah, the Ditford Regiment. Yeah, they're in Charleston, and Charleston is a great British triumph. I mean, some people after Charleston, the Hessians write, "This is it. The war's over. We won." Kind of. It was such great news, which of course didn't happen. So yeah, I'm glad he was able to log on.
Okay. Any other questions for anyone? Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Could you come up and help me for a second?
Thank you, everybody. you.